Good morning. My name is Jennifer Ryan, and on behalf of the Alliance of Women in Workers' Compensation, I want to welcome you to today's webinar. Today's webinar is titled Negotiate with Confidence, will last approximately 1 hour, and is a live interactive webinar being broadcasted today, Thursday, October 27th, 2022. Before we get started, I would like to thank our 2022 corporate sponsors for their support on hosting events such as this. They support us not because they want their logos up on a screen, but they support the cause, which is to affect positive change in the workers' compensation industry through networking, support, mentoring, and collaboration. The Alliance is inclusive of all professionals in workers' compensation, regardless of career stage, with the belief that we can all learn from and support each other. Please be sure to head to the AWWC website for all upcoming events. This year, we have been able to host webinars, collaboration sessions, as well as in-person events. Be sure to check back on our website for registration details. If you cannot make one of our virtual or in-person live events, don't worry. Webinars and our main board-led events will be recorded and on demand for our followers. Our theme this year is Acknowledge, Adjust, Advance. Each quarter, our live webinars and events will be centered around each mini-theme. This quarter will focus on our topics around Elevate Together. Be sure to join in these discussions as we facilitate both virtual and in-person events. I'm excited to announce that next year's theme is Together Towards Tomorrow. Stay tuned for more information regarding 2023 content, virtual and in-person events coming soon. Have you joined our book club yet? This year, we launched our 2022 book club with 6 books to choose from previous keynote speakers the Alliance had at our events in 2021. If you love reading books, be sure to head to the AWWC website to sign up to join the club, as you still have time to join for this quarter. We will be announcing 2023 book club information next month. Change is preceded by trust. It is through acceptance and inclusion that trust will be formed and positive impact will occur. The Alliance is committed to creating a safe space in the workers' compensation industry for women of diverse backgrounds and experiences through a shared culture that integrates various perspectives. This is who we are and who we will be. The time to do better and be better is now. The Alliance understands that diversity is a journey that will take time to make meaningful changes to our organization, its followers, and supporters. We will be intentional in making progress along our key pillars of change. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Gabby Lopiano as we learn how to negotiate with confidence. Negotiations are central to our everyday personal and professional lives. Yet, misconceptions about how to succeed in negotiations are widespread. Join us today as we dive into the art and science of negotiation and break down the commonly associated myths. In this webinar, you will learn research-backed strategies for effectively advancing your interests while maintaining and even strengthening your valuable relationships. Dr. Gabby Lopiano is an assistant professor of management at Vanderbilt University's Owen Graduate School of Management, where she teaches negotiations in the MBA program and organizational behavior to undergraduates. She also serves as a faculty representative on the Owen Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Board. Gabby received her PhD from Emory University's Business School. She researches the organizational implications of stigma, discrimination, and workplace diversity. Her current work focuses on the ways that adverse lifetime experiences, particularly those suffered by members of stigmatized social groups, can lead employees to develop unique skills and resiliencies that add value to their organizations. Further, she examines how inclusion and equitable organizational climates allow employees with stigmatized identities to thrive at work. Dr. Lopiano has been invited to present her work at National Center for Civil and Human Rights, at the Federal Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, and in Emory Executive Educational Programs, in addition to academic audiences. Prior to entering academia, she earned a bachelor's degree in civil engineering from Drexel University and an MBA from the University of Tampa, and also worked as a civil engineer for several years in Philadelphia. Thank you for the time you're spending with us today, and we hope you enjoy this webinar.
Thank you, Jen, for that introduction. Hoping everyone can hear me. I'm going to share my screen right now. All right, let's get started. So as Jen mentioned, my name is Gabriella Piano. I'm an assistant professor at Vanderbilt University, and I teach and do research on negotiations, particularly within communities or populations like women who have historically been underrepresented in organizations and also have, sort of tricky situations to navigate with when it comes to negotiations. So today we're going to talk about, what is negotiation and what it's not, importantly, why we should negotiate and how we should negotiate. And then I'll wrap up with a few key takeaways and we'll try to squeeze in some Q&A. Please join in the chat if you are able to, and I'll try to answer any questions that come up. So first, I just want you to stop and think what you think of when you think of the word negotiation. You can type it in the chat or think it to yourself or say it out loud, but just think what imagery comes to mind when you think of a negotiation. So you may have thought of a battle, of a war being ready to be fought. You might think of a shouting match where it's whoever's the strongest or the most dominant, the loudest voice in the room dominates and wins the negotiation. You might think of it as a battle of wits or an intricate chess game where you're trying to strategically outmaneuver the other party. And there's a winner and a loser. Most of us have this adversarial view of negotiations, one where we assume that the other party we're negotiating with has opposing interests to ours, where there's one winner and one loser and nothing in between. And rigidity prevails, meaning I don't want to concede to anything because that means I'm losing, I'm giving up something. And I hope by the end of this webinar, you understand that this is a very counterproductive way to think of negotiations. So with this perspective, this negative framing, it causes us to fail to recognize opportunities where we can negotiate for something more. It leads us to fail at finding the optimal or the win-win solutions in a negotiation. And it might prevent us from entering negotiations at all. What I want you to understand by the end of this webinar is that negotiation is not this one-size-take-all. It's a collaborative problem-solving process in which two or more parties come to mutually agree on a course of action that satisfies both their individual and their collective interests. And what do I mean by that? I mean, you're trying to fit these puzzle pieces that seem to not match up. You're trying to figure out a way to integrate them so you both walk away satisfied. Now, I'd like to tell you that the playing fields are level, but since this is an audience that's geared towards women and equity, I want to be very clear. Women are less likely to negotiate than men. And when they do, they ask for less. And I would love to say there's nothing for you to be afraid of, go for it. You do have to be mindful of the gendered stereotypes that we encounter in everyday life, right? So women are stereotyped as being highly communal, meaning we're expected to be nice and generous and show concern for others. And oftentimes we assume that we might face potential backlash, and oftentimes we do face backlash in negotiations because it is assumed to be this aggressive and dominating environment that's more in line with masculine stereotypes than with feminine stereotypes. But what I want you to understand today is that negotiations are not this masculine dominated space that we can't, as women, engage in. I'm going to suggest that you let those stereotypes work for you rather than against you. because things like empathy and collaboration go a very long way in negotiations. So let's talk about why we should negotiate. Why should we ask? So I want you to consider two women, Alex and Jane. Now, both Alex and Jane are 30 years old. They both just received a salary offer of $100,000 per year. Let's assume that they both stay in the same job throughout the rest of their career. This is a stylized example. And let's assume that they both get annual raises of 4%. So what I have plotted here is the trajectory of lifetime earnings that Alex and Jane would make if they never negotiated their salary. But now let's say that Jane negotiates her initial offer to $110,000. Now, this can change one's retirement, right? Let's also consider, now Jane now negotiates her raises every year. I'm going to just make sure that my audio is back on. Okay, great. Perfect. Okay, so let's consider now that Jane negotiates her raises to 5% per year instead of 4%. So every time an annual raise comes up, she negotiates to get higher than what Alex is getting. Now Jane's lifetime earnings increase by $2.8 million. And just to show the even further extreme, if Jane negotiates her raise to 6% every year over the 4% that Alex is getting, Jane now earns $5.3 million more than Alex over the course of her lifetime. So I hope what this illustrates for you is the importance of making the ask. You want to not be afraid to go to the table. The worst that can be said is no. Now, I want to be very clear about something. The goal of negotiating is not to get a deal. It's to get a good deal. But sometimes we fall prey to what's called the agreement bias. And this is our tendency to want to avoid conflict. And once we're at the negotiating table, we want to just make an agreement. And we have a temptation to agree to things that leave us worse off than we were before. But how do you know what a good deal is in a negotiation? Well, you need to know a minimum of 3 specific things before you enter a negotiation. You need to know what are your alternatives. You need to know what is your bottom line. And you need to know what is your aspiration. So for the alternatives, what will you do if you don't make a deal today, right? What will you do if you come to an impasse in this negotiation? In negotiations research, we term this the BATNA, or your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. It's your plan B. It's what you will do if a deal doesn't work out. Your BATNA is the greatest source of power you will have in a negotiation. I want you to consider the scenario. Consider you're selling your house. You have an offer in hand that's $10,000 over asking price, and you're negotiating with a second buyer. That puts you in a pretty good position to make an offer or to accept an offer, right? It puts you in a position where you don't need to go under ask because you already have a secure offer in hand. A strong BATNA gives you leverage in a negotiation. You want to signal its strength strategically. So I'm not saying you go in and you say exactly what that offer's for, but you go in and you suggest that I have an offer, a very strong offer on the table, and I'm willing to walk away from this negotiation. And that lets your counterpart know that they need to come up, that they need to come to make you an offer that is attractive to you. Considering the opposite, right? Let's say you have an offer in hand that's for $50,000 less than what you're asking for. That's a pretty weak negotiating position compared to the first example. A weak BATNA leaves you vulnerable in a negotiation. If you don't have an attractive alternative to walk away from and towards, you're going to be in a position of weakness in the negotiation. Sometimes this happens, right? Sometimes we're more dependent on getting a deal, and sometimes we're less dependent on getting a deal. What you don't want to do if you're in a position where your alternative is weak, you don't want to reveal it, even if you're pressed, right? So you don't want to be asked, well, what's your current salary, right? If you're thinking you're severely underpaid, you don't want to reveal what that is. Instead, you want to deflect that question and redirect the conversation to the deal at hand, right? You want to focus on all the reasons why we're at this negotiating table instead of a different negotiating table. This is a very, very key tip. If you can improve your BATNA before you enter a negotiation, you will drastically increase your outcomes. And why? It's because one, you will walk away having conceded for less, whether that means you go towards your alternative or you take a deal at hand. Number two, it will psychologically empower you to ask for more. So to the extent that you can secure another offer before entering a negotiation, secure an attractive alternative, it will drastically increase your outcomes. The second thing you want to know before you enter a negotiation is when will you walk away? Now, this is termed in negotiations research as the reservation point. So this is your bottom line. It's the minimum that you need to make yourself better off in this negotiation than your alternative, okay? It's based on your BATNA, but it's not necessarily the same. So I want you to consider you're buying a house, right? And let's say you find a house that you like. It's $400,000 and you're willing to pay that. But then your dream home comes on the market and it's $450,000. You might be willing to pay up to $450,000, $460,000 for that dream home. It's not necessarily exactly what your alternative is. It's not necessarily the $400,000, right? So consider it with jobs, right? Maybe you love your current job and you really don't want to leave, but you just want to get paid a little bit more. In order for you to actually take another job, you might have to make a lot more than you currently make. So you want to consider whether and how much you prefer the current option on the table, so the current thing you're negotiating for, over your BATNA, over your best alternative. You want to determine your reservation point before you negotiate. A lot of people make this mistake in that they let the negotiation change their walk-away point. It should not change during the negotiation unless some kind of new value is introduced. So maybe if you're negotiating salary, maybe you're not just negotiating salary, but you're also talking about vacation time, right? Some other issue is introduced, and then that might alter your reservation point. Ideally, you know all those issues that are going to be discussed before entering the negotiation, and you have a minimum for each one of those things of what you're willing to accept. Do not accept any offer below your bottom line. If you have done the homework, if you've done the legwork going into a negotiation, then you know that any one of those offers that are below your reservation point will leave you worse off. You're not going to walk away satisfied. You never want to reveal this number in a negotiation, however. Why is that? Because what happens if you say, well, this is the lowest I'm willing to go? That's exactly what you're going to get. You might think, well, I can bluff it, right? You can. And this is a strategy. This is a hardball tactic. This is a strategy that I don't necessarily recommend, because when we bluff in negotiations, we risk getting called on it. And it risks potential reputational damage and potential relationship damage. So if we really care about the person on the other side, or we care about forming a long-term relationship with them, we really don't want to bluff, right? Instead, we want to just focus on the value that we're bringing to the table and the value that the other side can get away from this, can get out of this negotiation. The final thing you want to know going into a negotiation, and this is very important for women, is what do you hope to achieve? You don't want to just set your sights on getting a little bit better than your alternative or a little bit better than your status quo, right? You want to make an optimistic assessment of what we can get in a negotiation. You want to set an ambitious yet reasonable target. You'll never get what you don't ask for. So how do you determine what's a good target? How do I know what I should shoot for? Well, you want to research as much as you can. When we're armed with information, the gender differences go away. So research as much as you can. Sites like Glassdoor and PayScale, right? Ask your network. You are all involved in a network that's very large, that's in the same industry. You can talk to people that you know to find out what's the right salary, what is the average going rate, right? And then you can decide, do I fall higher than that average, right? And so that can signal to you what you're worth, right? And I would also recommend for women to ask male allies, right? So because we don't want to just ask other women, because in case women haven't negotiated as hard, we want to know what our male counterparts are getting paid, and we want to ask for that. You want to try to determine or estimate the other party's BATNA or bottom line. So if you can, ask these types of questions in the negotiation, right? What are you going to do if we can't come to an agreement? Like, do you have another option? Or what's the most you're willing to go? Or what's a reasonable number sound like to you, right? Try to estimate what their bottom line is in the negotiation. And like I said, even though women set lower targets compared to men, these differences are drastically reduced, if not go away entirely, when we are armed with information. So use them to your advantage. Use that information to your advantage. Okay, so now I want to ask this question, because this question gets a variety of answers. Should you make the first offer in a negotiation? Why or why not? And I'd love to see your insights in the chat. Okay, I'm seeing some yeses, nevers, no. Yes, okay. All right, we're pretty split, 50-50. So one of the common misperceptions in negotiations is that we shouldn't make the first offer because we don't want to reveal our cards. This is, according to the research, a faulty strategy. What making the first offer does is it leverages a psychological bias that we call anchoring. It's our tendency to fixate on initial information that we receive, and we fail to adequately adjust away from it. What this means is that when you make a first offer in negotiation, it has a strong influence on final outcomes. There's been a lot of research done that shows that the person that makes the first offer, the final negotiated outcome is much closer to that person's offer than the other person's target. You want to set your first offer slightly above your target, slightly above your aspiration, not your bottom line. So you do not want to go into negotiation thinking about your bottom line. You want to go into a negotiation thinking about your target every single time. Your first offer should be above your target, but still reasonable, right? Because if it's above your target, you have room to make concessions, and now you look flexible. If it's too outrageous, though, it can potentially drive the other party away from the table or bring about, reputational and relational damage, right? And so this is where preparation comes back into play. If you know what a reasonable target is, what a reasonable first offer is, then there is no way that that could be offensive to someone, right? Especially if you bring the receipts, if you bring the data to back it up, right? So as much as you can, provide rationale or reference points to support your offer. So this might be past sales price, salary data, recent trends, right? Anything that you can do to support your ask and to support its reasonability, that will help solidify and cement the anchor. Another tactic you might use is to use precise instead of rounded numbers. Most people go into negotiations and they ask for a nice round number. What research has found is that when you ask for something that is more precise, so let's say a salary of $82,700 as opposed to $80,000, that's a more precise number, and it makes people think implicitly that you have done your homework, that there is a reason behind why that number is so precise. And so these types of things can help you solidify the anchor. The only times that you don't want to make the first offer, right, is when social norms dictate that you shouldn't, right? So the way that we offer jobs is you get an offer letter that has a salary and has terms to it, right? And you don't want to be talking about salary before that offer letter comes, right? You want to be secure with the offer letter in hand before you start negotiating. Another time you might not want to make the first offer is if you have no idea about what's reasonable. If there's no way for you to do the research, this is very, very rare nowadays because information is at our fingertips. But if you have no idea what's a reasonable offer and you really care about the long-term relationship, if you don't care about the long-term relationship, then you can embarrass yourself all you want in front of the other party, right? So if you're negotiating for a car and you want to make a very aggressive first offer, you're probably not going to see that person again. So go right ahead, try your best, right? But if it's somebody that you're trying to cultivate a long-term relationship with, then that is somebody that you would want to, maybe that is a time where you would want to refrain from making the first offer. So I've talked a lot about things that you should know going into a negotiation, and all of that is true. Preparation in advance is key to success in negotiations. But going back to my first point about understanding that negotiations are not this opposing dyadic interaction, they are a collaborative interaction. I want to tell you a story that's told in every negotiations class across the country. The story goes is that there's two sisters. They one day were arguing over the last orange in the house. They were fighting and arguing and bickering for, a few hours. And finally, their mom got so upset and they said, you know what, enough. I'm just going to cut down the center of the orange and give you both half. And, that's an equitable solution, right? Both sisters got half the orange. Both were still upset. Both left that encounter extremely upset. Why would that be? Well, it turns out that one sister actually wanted the juice of the orange because she was craving a nice fresh glass of orange juice. The other sister wanted the rind of the orange, and the recipe for this cake that she was baking called for the rind of a full orange, so half wasn't going to cut it. And so what this example, the stylized story illustrates is that we have to take into consideration what each party actually wants in a negotiation. Because if we go into it assuming that our interests are directly opposed, we're going to fail to find the best outcomes, the most optimal outcomes for everyone. And so what we want to do in negotiations, and here's where we can really lean into our communal stereotypes as women, is to uncover underlying interests. You want to know your own needs, wants, and concerns in the negotiation, but you also want to understand the needs, wants, and concerns of your counterpart. So in order to do that, you need to build trust with them. You need to take their perspective. You need to really put yourself in their shoes to understand, why are they at this negotiating table? What is it that they want? What is it that they need out of this? What is it that they need from me? We're really good at figuring out what we want. Sometimes it's a lot harder to figure out what somebody else wants. One way you can do that in negotiations is to ask open-ended probing questions. Try to stay away from questions that have a yes or no answer, because that doesn't provide you with a lot of information. Get them talking about what they need. What are they here for? How can we work together to figure this out, figure this problem out, right? That we both leave better off. Not only do you want to ask them, you also want to share your own interests, share a little bit, make yourself a little bit vulnerable, right? Because what happens if you're negotiating in a salary negotiation or a job negotiation, and you ask for more salary and they say that they can't do that, and you express that, the reason I need more salary is because childcare has gotten so expensive. Well, maybe they actually have a childcare supplement. Right? Maybe there's a different way for you to get to your desired outcome, but you won't know that unless you share some of your interests. Look for things that you have in common. Look for common ground, right? Maybe when you're negotiating a new job, you want to be in a certain location. Maybe that's the exact location that the company needs someone, right? Maybe that exact location is where they've had trouble filling a position. And so you won't know that unless you start to reveal these things in the conversation. You also want to look for where you might have different priorities, because when you have different priorities in a negotiation, that allows for trade-offs, meaning you can trade off something you don't care as much about, but the other side cares a lot about, and you can get something that you really care about. So you're giving up less to get more. Convey positive emotions and a willingness to work together. Now, this is something that can really, really help women in negotiations. So what research has found is that when women pair their ask in a negotiation with a communal orientation, so when you can express how your ask and getting what you're asking for will help the organization, that's a way that really, really buffers any kind of negative effects that we might see in gendered negotiations. And using positive emotions. Some people have this idea that you should go into negotiations with a poker face, right? Or maybe even display some anger. And that usually backfires. Positive emotions are contagious. Positive emotions lead to creative thinking. Creative thinking helps you find these win-win solutions, these solutions that maximize value for both parties. One other tip for women especially, but for everyone, is to frame your proposals as solutions to their problems. So help me help you. Here's a solution that works for me, and here's how I see it working for you based on everything that you've just shared with me. And finally, you want to negotiate in packages, not issue by issue. And so what do I mean by that? I mean, you want to maximize trade-off value in negotiations. So let's consider an example. Let's say you're negotiating a new job offer. You care a lot about salary. You also care about flexibility and promotion. Let's say your employer values start date. They really need to get someone in there quickly. And then they also care about performance. And to some extent, they care about salary and costs. Let's say you get the offer letter and you start negotiating salary first. And you negotiate it one back and forth, and finally you land on a salary. And you had to give up a little bit from what you wanted. Now your employer says, okay, well, we really need you to start next Monday, but you had a vacation planned. Now you have no leverage because you already negotiated salary and didn't negotiate things in a package. So when you're giving something up, you should always be getting something. So you can't, when you're making concessions on a single issue, it loses its ability to create leverage for other issues. So a better approach is to say, well, how about if I start Monday, can we go up a little bit? Can we go up another 5,000 on the salary, right? Another way you might leverage trade-offs is if you put in some kind of a contingency clause, right? So some kind of pay for performance. So maybe you can't go up on the salary, but if I ask for an end of the year bonus contingent on my performance, right? You might be able to get more income that way. And so you want to be firm on your interests, but flexible on how you might achieve them, right? And so another thing that people often can ask for, if they can't ask for a salary increase, because sometimes employers have a range and they just are restricted to go too high, too much higher than that, right? Another strategy might be to ask to speed up the time for promotion. And so this is a tactic you can use if you're hitting a wall with strategy. So you don't need to necessarily get to the outcome, the salary amount that you want just on your base salary. You can use things like bonuses. You can use things like time to promotion, time to a raise. So speed it up. Let's say your promotion is coming in the next 2 years. Why not ask for us to visit that in 18 months or 12 months, right? And that's another way that you can create value in a negotiation. And so the main takeaways that I really want to hope that you leave here today with is to, one, reframe your perspective. Don't think of negotiations as this adversarial battle that you're entering, because then we might not enter it in the first place. Reframe it as this collaborative problem-solving approach, right? It's this problem-solving process where we're just trying to make our individual puzzle pieces fit together. How do we get the best value out of the negotiation for each one of us? Second, prepare. It's very important. It will help in your success, and it will eliminate gender biases. If you are armed with information, you know what your best alternative is. You have a great alternative. You've improved that BATNA before you enter the negotiation. You've done homework on your counterpart, right? You know what they value. You know what the field is paying, or you know what the average sale price for a certain commodity is. Preparation helps attain value in negotiations. And finally, you want to look for those win-win solutions. They're not very difficult once you build trust with the opposing party, right? If you can build trust and you can reveal your interests and take the perspective and understand their interests, you will create more value at the table, and both sides will walk away satisfied. And so the last thing I just want to leave you with is to pose this hypothetical question to you if you're feeling a little uncomfortable with entering negotiations, is how much are you willing to pay to avoid the discomfort of negotiating? And that's what I have for you today. So if there are any questions, I'd love to take them. Thank you all for coming. I'm happy to stick around, answer any questions. If you want to see a recording of this webinar, it'll be on the website shortly. Here's a question. Would you say emotional intelligence plays in negotiations? Absolutely. Being both self-aware of your emotions and aware of others' emotions, showing empathy, understanding other people's perspective and emotions in a negotiation is a fantastic skill. And it's something that we as women are trained to do from birth. We're trained to care about other people. Lean into that in negotiations. It will pay off. And I'm happy to supply the slide deck. If anyone has any questions, I'm always interested in talking to people. Always wanting to help women advance their outcomes in negotiations. So feel free to send me an email. Here's a question. Are there any dynamics that play out by having the last word? For instance, if I make a point and want the other person to weigh in, if I start to answer my own question or weigh in rather than wait for a response, that could shift the power, yes. I'm not sure I'm following the question exactly, but you don't want to make the other party feel unheard. You actually want to make them feel completely heard. But if you want to, if the question starts to go in a direction that doesn't seem like it's playing to your advantage, what you can do is say, you know, I'm hearing you say this, right? And then say, where I think we could go with this is in X direction. Here's how I think we can meet your needs while also meeting mine. And you can still have that kind of last word, but still allowing the other party to feel heard. Any other questions? All right, I think, you know, here's an anonymous question. Is it appropriate to mention a colleague's salary in raise negotiations? I would recommend not doing that. That could put your employer on the spot in a way that backfires against you. If you can get some sort of like industry data or any other kind of objective information where you're not sort of throwing your colleague under the bus or you know, putting your employer in a position where it might feel like you're calling them unfair or discriminatory. That may well be the case, but you don't want to do that when you're negotiating for a raise, right? If you can back it up with multiple people where you don't have to single someone out and you actually have some data, I think that would be a better approach. I also think harping on the value that you bring to the company, if you could cite your own performance data, that would be more powerful than specifically mentioning a colleague's raise. All right. All right. Well, I think that's everything. So thank you all again. And remember that the recording will be on the website. Thanks, everyone.